I have just returned from Lightbox EXPO and NONSTOP Barcelona, two fantastic art events at which I presented this talk, Appeal and the Objectively Good. Now, I made some feeble attempts to record both talks on my tablet, but they were both pretty rubbish. The problem is, I've promised too many people that I would share it online, so I have presented the talk for the third and final time, sitting at my desk to an audience of stuffed animals for your viewing pleasure. Welcome everybody to Appeal and the Objectively Good. Let us first align on what I mean when I say appeal. It is the quality that attracts and interests the viewer. Qualities we find admirable, beautiful, intriguing, and engaging. All the good stuff. It's very easy to get lost in the subtleties of these definitions and how they precisely map onto artistic concepts. But I'm using this word because to me it encompasses the broadest set of desirable qualities. In this talk, appeal is the goal. Now, I don't just want to take you to this conclusion directly. Instead, I want to go through a longer path, understand some deeper concepts, and expand our brains a little bit whilst we're at it. To get to this goal, we need to start with the other half of this talk's title, the Objectively Good. So we're going to leave the beautiful, flowery, abstract backgrounds and instead go into the classroom. Here we have an object and a subject. The object is an apple. It is red, shiny, edible. And the subject is me or you or anybody that has a thought process, a consciousness. The object has properties we can observe or test for. And these properties are factual or logical. But once the object is filtered through the subject, we see the formation of subjective properties based on feelings or intuition. For example, I might find that the apple is tasty. It might be my favorite fruit. It might make me happy when I see one. So it's time for an art example. This artwork has objective qualities. It is called Carnation Lily Lily Rose. It was painted by John Singer Sargent in 1885. It's oil on canvas and roughly depicts two girls surrounded by foliage. It also has subjective qualities, filtered through me, the subject. And when I respond to the painting, feel that it is beautiful. I think it's timeless, it's my favorite painting, it's inspiring, it's like really good. In contrast, we have this next example. This also has objective qualities. It is called Squirrel Girl with Background.png. It's a digital piece. It also depicts a girl surrounded by foliage, in this case, and squirrels. So the subjective qualities, well, when it filtered through me, I find that it is quite amateur. It displays a poor understanding of anatomy, overuses Photoshop filters. The background looks a bit like vomit. It's a bit cringe when I look at it. And we have a few more objective qualities. It was made in February 2013 by a Mr. Thomas Chamberlain Keane. Okay, I almost feel bad putting these next to each other on the same slide, but the Sargent painting is obviously better, right? Subjectively, there's no question. But is it objectively better? At some point, if enough people all subjectively agree on something, doesn't it hint at something objective underneath? And how do we determine that without using feelings or intuition? Well, an excellent place to start is by examining the skills required to make the artwork, the fundamentals. The fundamentals help us understand reality. But following fundamentals to their logical extreme tends us towards realism. And whilst Carnation Lily Lily Rose is certainly more realistic than Squirrel Girl with Background, I'm sure we'll all agree that chasing realism is not the key to appeal. I'm often reminded of this piece, an internet classic, photorealistic Santa Claus created in Microsoft Paint. It's certainly a technical achievement, but I'm not sure it's something any of us really want hanging up inside their homes. What we're missing in this understanding is stylization, something that artists use in all sorts of ways and moves us away from realism, but still creates images that humans find appealing. Now, what I really need to make this point clear is another artwork with a comparable level of stylization, preferably the same subject matter, color scheme, camera angle, and so on. And ever eager to find ways to procrastinate, I drew it myself. May I present Squirrel Girl with Background.png plus 12 years of experience. Now, I'm not going to claim it's particularly original, innovative, but hopefully everyone in the audience can agree that it is significantly more appealing across the board. Anatomy, shape design, colors, lighting, shading, etc. So the fundamentals are able to guide us to appeal that isn't strictly realistic, which tells me that the secrets to appeal lie deeper as well. So we've dug down past style, past fundamentals, to a place I'll be calling raw experience. And very basically, these are our senses. We're talking about visual art here, so we're really only concerned with what comes in through our eyes. But of course, it's important to note that we can attempt to recreate the experience from the other senses through purely visual means. Comics do this all the time with emanata, abstract or symbolic ways to communicate sounds or smells. There are a myriad of examples that we could look at, but we must move on, so tangent over. We'll start with a single eye. It can experience darkness, it can experience light, it can experience color. Now, we need some form of contrast to recognize that we have any sense of vision at all. If you woke up in a black void, there'd be no way to tell if you were experiencing black or had simply lost your vision. Wake up in a white void and you've got some clues. You can look at your body, you can blink your eyes, experiencing the red light filtering through your eyelids. As you all are sitting in an audience looking at this presentation, you see a white rectangle surrounded by a conference hall, or since I'm now recording this at home, surrounded by your room, the outside of your computer screen. And with this information, you're immediately given all the contrast you need to recognize this as a white void. But I want you to imagine you are truly immersed in the image, much like the experience of watching a film and simply losing track of your surroundings. In this white void, with nothing to compare to, there is no difference to the black void. Ultimately, if there is no change in what is coming in through our eyes, there is no experience. And humans crave experience, so we need that contrast, otherwise we're unable to experience anything. So that was easy. Number one rule of appeal is contrast. Hopefully that makes sense. And so we'll move on. Now, does more contrast always mean better? Well, no. We need to talk about contrast within contrast. The more layered, the better. I'm pulling this slide from my previous talk about contrast, and hopefully it shows you how you can easily show elements of contrast by setting up areas without it. Essentially a pattern. So the majority of these images are the same. There is no contrast, and then only one element stands out. And we also get areas like this, where one thing stands out more than the others because there is more contrast with the established norm. And I delved more into this in my previous talk, but of course you can set this up with anything. And it's a really fun exercise to choose some random, maybe abstract, maybe very specific element of a painting and find out what you need to do to set up contrast within that. But this is now a great opportunity to delve into patterns. Humans have excellent pattern recognition. And you see this everywhere around us. It doesn't have to purely be visual. It can also be in abstract things like numbers, experiences, or just rule sets that propose themselves once you see them repeat. For example, a dot connected to a line, connected to a dot, connected to a line. It doesn't matter what the shape is, we see the pattern repeat and we start to understand how we'll be able to continue it. For me, the most universally experienced form of pattern recognition is pareidolia, and it's also a lot of fun. We see faces in everything, be them man-made structures or natural structures. It could be the inside of objects revealed once we cut them open. It could be faces that we find in designed structures that were never supposed to look like a face, but through some change in the weather, for example, or just under certain lighting, we start to see all these interesting characters form. And these are really fun examples because these ones have specificity. On the right, this guy almost looks like he has a shiny gold tooth. There's a slight shine to his eye. And on the left, the drip that has caused this nose to look like it is dripping because it's cold just adds to the sense that this is a real being that has biological processes and things like that that give it more character than the underlying shapes would alone. This next example is important because it shows that we can learn patterns very, very quickly. Hopefully you were tricked by this in the same way the reply was, thinking it was a video because we have become so accustomed to seeing this little white triangle on top of an image and thinking that it's a video we can click to play. It is, of course, just the little stand that keeps the lid off the top of the pizza. But with that context, that humans are very, very quick to pick up on new patterns, Hopefully, I do not need to explain anything about this next slide. And at this point, I'm really just having fun finding excellent examples of pareidolia that make me happy. But something really special about this is that it shows from abstraction, we can get closer and closer to things that look like real designs, something very, very intentional. Like this little guy that feels like they could be dropped straight into the Robots movie. And these particularly strong examples of pareidolia can come from the more symbolic side like this, or ones that sort of represent something a little more maybe realistic. I think this example is wonderful because it's got this beautiful blend of a very realistic facial structure, very realistic lighting, and yet it is also abstracted down to simply two values. If I actually do a little quick painting of this, it almost looks like a master painter has come along, and if I were to just paint this from scratch in front of you, you would marvel at my understanding of form and being able to predict exactly how light will hit it without having to construct it and all that. Like, it really feels like someone understands their fundamentals if they were able to just pull this out from imagination. And since it looks so good, I might as well put my signature on it. And in this final example, I have my wife's lunchbox. Now, I'll give you a moment to try and look for what I see in these patterns. And if I rotate it, perhaps it becomes a little clearer. And finally, I'll zoom in on the area I'm most interested in. And I see this face every day when I see this lunchbox. And it's really appealing to me because, again, it has that level of abstraction. It feels like the decisions going into simplifying these shapes that still represent something real is something an artist would choose to do and isn't simply born out of randomness. And what this helped me understand is that it isn't necessary to start with clean construction based in reality. We can start with abstract patterns that humans instead interpret because we're always looking to make sense of the things around us. And so from this place of abstraction, we can slowly build back, adding more and more little patterns that convince the viewer what they're looking at is more and more a face rather than a series of shapes. And so this is a little example. I was really just having fun again, being distracted from actually writing the talk and painting over it until it starts to feel like a very deliberate composition. And as you can see, the further it progresses, the more it starts to resemble that picture from the beginning, Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose, which is quite deliberate. I thought it would be quite fun to show the two next to each other. But we can also get an appreciation for how abstract paintings can be, certainly when we zoom into areas of them. For example, when I wanted to add flower to the background of my pareidolia piece, really I was just indicating where light was hitting the flowers against a dark, murky background. And that really isn't dissimilar from how Sargent approached it. So ultimately, it's humans' desire to find patterns in everything they see that allows us to create artwork with very abstract representations of real objects. And in this last example, I simply want to show you something that I do occasionally in my free time because I find it to be fun. I'll take an image that's filled with details, filled with things that have very specific meanings, especially where I've rendered them very tightly. I'll put a random transform on it, be it rotation, stretch, warp, flip it, and then overlay it with either lighten or darken. And the result is undeniably chaotic. But because there are so many instances of very specific renders within the piece, I think our brains automatically want to understand this as a real space. There's kind of like two different messages being sent. One is the overall, the large shapes, the overlaps, the things that don't make sense yet. And then the other message is specific rendering that is designed to look like a real object. And so we're being told that this image is both real and abstract at the same time. And so we're looking for ways to make sense of it. And personally, when I see it, there's perhaps like a huge cathedral leading up into the ceiling. You can kind of see pews, wooden pews along the sides. Or perhaps I see some sort of almost angelic creature emerging from above, these radial patterns looking a little like golden wings. But I could mess around with this technique forever and show you all sorts of examples, but it's a digression, we must move on. So, rule number 2 of appeal, patterns. And hopefully we understand how we got there. One eye gives us contrast. When we have to think about contrast and how to represent it, we think about establishing patterns that allow us to understand those. And of course, pattern recognition being one of humans' strongest traits. So, the logical next step is adding a second eye to the mix. What sort of information do we get from 2 eyes rather than 1? Well, we might expect to simply double the amount of vision we have. 2 eyes, twice as much vision. Very cool. But it's not quite that simple. This diagram shows how the cone of vision from each eye overlaps. And you might think that this is an inefficient use of each eye. Why not do what the sheep does? Rotate those eyes out to the side and instead extend your field of vision to cover almost 360 degrees, like a massive 300 degrees of vision. Surely that's better. It's like having an ultra-wide monitor. But the difference is that that overlap section in the middle gives us binocular vision. And that's something that we have much, much more of compared to a sheep. So if we were to close one eye, we can simulate what it's like to have monocular vision. Things appear flat, essentially like they do on a computer screen or on a piece of paper. But when we look at objects in the center of our vision, something special happens. Each eye sees those objects slightly differently. In the left eye, the circle appears to overlap the square, though I should really say sphere and cube. They are 3D objects. And then in the right eye, the sphere does not overlap the cube. And you can see this happening because when we draw a trace, a straight line back to the eye, this outer edge of the cube no longer intersects the sphere as it traces back, unlike in the left eye, where it does. You can see it traces through right there. So each eye sees the scene slightly differently. This is a stereographic image created by Theo Prins, and if you're feeling ambitious, you can try looking at the screen, crossing your eyes, and essentially you'll be able to get a 3D illusion. I won't go into the details of that now. The important thing is, whilst these two images may not appear very different to begin with, if I overlay them with the classic red-blue filter, you can see the offsets certainly towards the background where objects get further and further away. You can see how this offset's slightly smaller than this one because this is further into the distance compared to the foreground where the offset gets smaller and smaller. These offsets are the things that allow us to create depth in an image once they are represented in each eye individually. And this may be more intuitive to you now if you've had any experience with a VR headset, because that is exactly how those work. A separate image for each eye, and by rendering each eye at a different place in the game or whatever experience there is through the VR headset, you get a realistic sense of depth. And so, with all that set up, we can talk about tangents. Now, for the longest time, tangents to me was something that I only experienced in mathematics. It was the line that touches a circle at the circumference, and then the angle of that line was determined by it being a 90-degree angle from the radius. Sorry, that wasn't particularly elegant, but it doesn't really matter. We're talking about art now. So the word comes from tangere, which means to touch. And that's the most important part for us. We're concerned with areas of our artwork that seem to touch each other. So when depicting a scene, the most difficult part is translating a 3D space into 2D. Unless we're being very strict with a life drawing session or something like that, we have full control over where we place these images in the scene. And hopefully in these two examples, you can immediately see which one works and which one doesn't. On the left, we have a very sort of natural feeling composition, whereas on the right, there is this awkward tangent between each of the shapes that makes it unclear how they actually fit into 3D space. Now, of course, as simply line art, we're not going to have as much information about the scene. But I can add extra information in, for example, shadows, cast shadows. And whilst these do start to help give us extra information about how this sphere is definitely sitting behind these objects on this plane, there's an awkwardness that you can't shake. These feel even clearer. It's so much more obvious that these are existing in 3D space, stacked behind each other, whereas here we can't get away from this awkwardness of these tangents. So they're bad. We typically want to avoid them. But the complication here is that humans do not see tangents very often. This is a digression. We will not go there for now. Now, humans definitely see when objects are touching. So in this example, the sphere touches the cube, and in both our left and our right eye, it is very clear that these two objects are touching each other. But if we try to set up a scene where they are not touching each other in the 3D space, but still appear to be touching each other in our vision, well, only one eye is going to give us that information. So we've moved the sphere back. So in the left eye, the sphere appears to be separate from the cube, whereas in the right eye, they do appear to be touching. The only difference being that this sphere has now shrunk slightly. Of course, in this flat space, it is a circle, and it's a slightly smaller circle than it was before. And we could shift these around a little bit so that now in the left eye, they appear to be touching. But then in the right eye, they no longer are. They're overlapping instead. So we can now follow some logical steps. If we don't want objects to appear like they're touching in the real 3D space, then we need to avoid this. We need to avoid any instance where they appear to be touching in the 2D space. We can cancel those out from both examples where they are not touching, and then we're left only with spacing and overlap. Now, this conclusion may seem very obvious and very easy to execute on, but the important part is recognizing just how powerful tangents are. If we choose to put a tangent in our artwork, we are communicating this scenario and this scenario only. And that's because the only human experience that sees a tangent appear in both eyes at once is when the objects really are touching. So whilst these techniques, adding overlap and spacing, certainly aren't new, hopefully you can appreciate why it is so crucial that you do it anytime objects are actually at different depths in a scene. So it's time to go back to some examples. Here I have Squirrel Girl with background, except I have removed the color so that it's a little easier to appreciate where the tangents are and are not. This was originally a moment for audience participation, so you're going to have to just go along with me at home, perhaps point at the screen. Can you spot the tangents? Well done, you did it! Okay, in all seriousness, it was a fantastic example because I didn't know about it at the time, but I was setting up a beautiful tangent with the jacket, how it touches the hip here, but really should be floating in front, and how it touches the arm here, and again, really should be some distance in front. I don't want these to appear like they're actually resting on each other. Similarly, there's a few more sort of subtle things down here where the skirt just kind of awkwardly aligns with other curves that exist in the basket already. So I now have an opportunity to fix these. In my redraw, I wanted to make sure that any time I had those lines getting close to each other, I made it very, very clear that there was a good amount of space between them. So we'll start with the overlap. Here I've blocked in the shapes that are being overlapped, and you can see it's a much larger area than I had before. A much larger proportion of the basket is now hidden behind the jacket, and this helps us understand that it is being overlapped more clearly. The tail line here could have come in right at the corner here, but it would have resulted in a very, very small triangle of overlap. And so I'm looking for ways to make sure that it's very clear. I've moved this line down, and that gives us a more substantial chunk where our mind will sort of continue this line in our headspace and we'll understand that this tail is definitely behind both the leg and the skirt. And then I mentioned it a little bit more already, but spacing between these areas is just as important. When this jacket is getting close to the hip like it did on the original, I'm making sure that there is a very clear gap between the two. I've even gone as far as making sure that these lines, when they do get close, are actually curving away from each other, just so it doesn't look like they're about to join. And that spacing exists everywhere. I don't want this spacing to be too consistent. I could start to flatten the image, but I need to make sure that there is a minimum amount of spacing employed. Otherwise, from a distance, you won't be able to tell. And to sort of demonstrate how subtle this gets at a smaller level, here I have the line of the hand, and it's actually touching the line of the tail. This is a deliberate tangent in a sense, because I do want it to look like this tail is resting on the far fingers. It's coming out of the back of the sleeve, and so it is in line with the little finger over here. Meanwhile, the head of the squirrel should definitely appear like it's in front of both of them. So I have a very, very clear opposing line. It's a rotation from this line coming in, and it's very, very clear that it's tucking behind. Now, I mentioned how the tangent is used deliberately in this case to appear like they're touching, but there's other ways to make things look like they're touching in an image. And here I've kind of lost this edge by blending the two together, and it's a bit more artistic and abstract. It's a way to make it appear like these soft objects are touching each other. Maybe even the fabric fur and the fluff from the tail are starting to slightly interlock. And finally, at this scale, I already mentioned how spacing is really important, and there has to be a sort of a minimum amount, but in some cases it can still be very, very subtle. So I want to make it clear that this far edge of the sleeve is wrapping around behind the head. And so instead of having this line sort of continue down and start to look like maybe it starts to follow the line of the ear here, I have this little nub. And essentially it provides this padding so that it's very clear that this line comes down, wraps down behind, and then you can imagine that line rotating all the way through and connecting on this side where it tucks behind the thumb. So these are very subtle additions, but each of them are designed to add extra information about what's happening in 3D space. But there are plenty more tools that we can use. So I have a new example. It's quite a cluttered and chaotic scene at the moment, and what we're going to do is employ each of these tools to try and make this scene read more clearly. At first, we'll stick just in line art. We can use simplification. So we have the dragon at the front, covered in the scales, the details that we want to see, and all this stuff in the background. As in real life, we start to lose some of the detail because we can't see that stuff up close. We can also use value range. So here I have each of these layers of line work separated, which means I can simply turn down the opacity of them. But it's not such a strong effect when we're just in line art. Instead, we need to move into values. And by adding these in, we can truly appreciate the difference we get by controlling our value range from areas that are close to the camera and areas that are in the distance. And more commonly, we understand this as atmospheric perspective. There is atmosphere in between that scatters light and makes the values tend towards brighter and bluer colors. And lastly, an important one that I think is often overlooked is scale reference. Sometimes we want to make sure that an object has a scale reference by putting just a single person in next to whatever it is that we're designing. But we often forget that we can put more than just one person in. We know roughly what the size of a human is, even within the range between someone that's big and someone that's small. And so by putting them at different depths in the scene, we immediately get a very, very clear scale reference for every layer. So we discussed binocular vision, but to achieve depth perception, we also need depth of field. Now, depth of field is another thing that just comes built into us humans. When we focus on something, it is the focal point because only that part of our vision is in focus. Things that are much further away or much closer to us may appear blurry, like the square and the triangle. But I've already talked about how the different distance is the thing that actually affects how blurry it is. So to make this example a little more convincing, we also want to see the scale change. Here it's very clear that the circle is close to us because we're assuming each of these shapes is roughly the same size, and as it goes further away, it gets blurrier because it moves out of our focal range. And I could do the same thing coming towards us. And this is probably the most common use of depth of field in artworks, where we want to make it feel like something's very close to the camera. Perhaps we're slightly claustrophobic, or we're hiding behind something, and still focusing beyond that object to, for example, the circle behind. And instead, these foreground shapes, they act like almost like a vignettes on the screen. They're big and they're very blurry, and we don't know exactly what they are, but they can give us an immediate sense of depth. And now, if I stitch the two examples together, we get a very clear range where something is out of focus because it's close, it becomes in focus with the circle, and then becomes out of focus again because it's too far away. Now, being able to look at objects that are out of focus is a strange luxury afforded to us either through artistic expression or, more commonly, the use of cameras. Our normal human experience of the world is that when we want to look at an object, we look at it, our eyes automatically focus on it, generally with very little effort from our part, and immediately it becomes in focus. So we don't actually get to focus on anything that is blurry, because the blurry is a result of it being out of focus. It seems a bit circular, but hopefully you can understand. It's probably worth experimenting with this a little bit outside of this video. For example, if you bring your hand close to your face, you can focus on it, and if you look behind, you'll see that it becomes blurry and out of focus. But you can't ever really look at that. You can't look at the blurriness, because as soon as you do, it becomes in focus again. Anyway, hold on to that idea because it'll become more relevant when we talk about filmic versus illustrative works. Before that though, I just want to demonstrate how we would use depth of field in an artwork like this. So, as the object gets further away from the camera, things get blurrier. And this happens at a very quick fall off. So typically, if this dragon's head was in focus, even once we get back to his tail, it's already getting really quite out of focus. And then it's not like a linear increase as we get back to the castle. It's not that the castle is completely blown out and completely out of focus. The exact sort of fall off of how things stay in and out of focus is something you'd have to study from photography or in a very sort of scientific paper that breaks that down. Nonetheless, it is clearly very, very effective. And now it's immediately obvious what part of the scene we should be looking at. And again, if we were there in person, it's telling us what the person/the camera is actually focusing and training its vision on. And I can flip that around and do the opposite. The background is now crisp and in focus. The town is just ever so slightly out of focus. And then all of the dragon, especially the head, which is getting really close to us, becomes very blurry. Now, this may seem like an odd choice for a single illustration. Typically, we would want to see the dragon. That's the interesting thing. It's the thing that doesn't exist, that we haven't experienced before. But you can imagine that in a film, you might pull focus. So starting focused on the dragon, something we establish with, and then moving into the background to show what's behind them now that we understand what the dragon is and we've seen the details of it. And lastly, I want to show you this because having talked about focus, when we're thinking about how we apply this in Photoshop, we're actually really talking about blurs. And there are lots of different types of blur. This one is a motion blur. It's a radial blur, which means it actually has a focal point. Essentially, it is blurring only in one direction. So if you imagine drawing that direction out as a line, each of these lines points towards a single point on the screen. And so that's a radial blur that gives us this zooming effect. And it is accurate to real life. If the camera was moving along this vector away from this point, then all of these objects are going to blur because they're moving too fast for the camera to capture information about them within that shutter speed. We won't go into specifics about how cameras work and things. Hopefully, motion blur is fairly intuitive. But it has the same effect. If we compare it to this again, we're essentially losing information in the background where things are moving fast, and we're keeping information in the foreground where things are locked to the camera's view. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, we can talk about filmic versus illustrative uses of blur in illustration. So here is a large illustration. I've cropped it down a little bit, but I'm showing everything. And if it was to be a slightly more filming approach, well, it's only going to be on screen for a certain amount of time. That's sort of the big difference between a still artwork and a film, is that the film controls how long something is visible, and typically it is not long at all, versus an illustration which you can stand and stare at for as long as you like. So in a film, I might want to make it very clear that this is our main character, and then, like I mentioned earlier, we might pull focus away from him to the background and then show that bit. Essentially, this controls the flow of information to the viewer, and it tells us what we should be paying attention to at any point in time. But like I said, typically I'm thinking more illustrative. I don't want to create this as a concept for a film. I want it to stand on its own as an illustration. And to do that, I really want to get the viewer to look at every part of the piece. I want them to be able to look around as if they were really there, focus on each bit individually, and enjoy all of it together. And that's why typically I'm keeping everything in focus. And you can see that approach carried through to this one. These objects in the foreground are obviously very, very close to us. Realistically, if we were focused on this point in the background and actually standing here in the scene, these would have to become slightly out of focus. There's no way our eyes could focus on both at once. But I imagine that I'm standing in the scene and looking around, experiencing it, essentially with time. So if I stood here and looked at this would become in focus. And then if I moved my head down and to the left, I would start to focus on this little gnome in the foreground and the details here. And within my head, I would build up a mental image, which is more accurate to this illustration, where anytime I want to look and focus at something, it becomes in focus. I can see all the details. And the mental image that I build is this one, something where the entire scene is in focus all at once. Now, I'd really spent a lot of the budget for making this talk already, so we're moving to napkin sketches so I could get through it faster. Here I'm trying to demonstrate that same idea. We have our viewer, essentially this is the camera, this is the person that's experiencing the scene, and if they were to look around this scene, a bunch of floating cubes, they could look up, they could look in front of them, and they could look down. And by doing this, they would get all these different angles, different perspectives on the scene. And essentially this lets us do the exact same thing I was talking about with things being in or out of focus, but instead with views of the scene. If I take all of these and start to stitch them together, again imagining what would happen in our mind's eye, you can see at first these perspectives don't align with each other. They're accurate within that window. For example, you can see all these lines are converging to a vanishing point that would be down here, and here all these lines are converging to a vanishing point that would be up here. But if I plot these out next to each other, obviously these lines are intersecting, and perspective lines cannot do that. However, you can also see that all of these lines are representing what is vertical in the image, these vertical edges of the cubes. And there is some sort of pattern emerging. Essentially, the lines from the top image are all leaning towards the center, the top side, and then the opposite lean is happening on the bottom. And if you imagine you took a snapshot that was in between these two, so my head tilted just a little bit down or just a little bit up, well, you can imagine the same lines will be there, except they won't have such an extreme angle on them. And so, following that logic, where the perspective line that indicates what vertical is slowly gets more and more and more angled towards the center, certainly on this side, essentially what we get is a curve. This line is, if you took this segment from the center it is vertical. If you took this segment here, it's leaning over slightly. If you took this segment here, it's leaning over a lot, which is exactly what happens when we move our eye up and down this scene. And so what we've essentially done is derived a curvilinear perspective just from looking up and down, and you could do this with left and right in a scene. And again, I find this to be a very illustrative way to represent scenes because it is closer to our human experience. When we stand in a place, when we stand against an open vista, we can look everywhere. We can look up and down, left and right, and we build this mental map of the entire view of the space, even though we're focusing on individual elements one by one. And you can see, hopefully here, I have created a fairly convincing looking curvilinear perspective, but I simply did it by combining these three images together and then smoothing out the areas in between. For example, these two cubes were obviously no longer aligned in the center here. And so what I needed to do was basically find the in-between state between a line that here would be horizontal, and in this case was tilting down towards the left. I need to find that in-between where it tilts down just a little bit to the left. So I'm not actually following a specific grid. Instead, I'm looking at the pattern that's been established and making sure that I follow that pattern. Which leads me to a concept that I call pattern perspective. And this really is how I feel humans can intuit perspective when they're creating artwork. But also I find it's the most important part of that final artwork. We can start constructing a scene with a perspective grid, and we can start by constructing very accurate, for example, cubes that represent objects we want to be in the scene. But it's very unlikely that our final image actually has any of those original perspective lines still there. Instead, we're looking at shapes that have been derived from our perspective grid. And all we can really get from those shapes is in a sense of what pattern they're following. Are they following the pattern that gives us perspective information? So this example here, I have some repeating shapes, and all I've done is make sure that whatever pattern is established, for example, in these vertical lines, they rotate to the right each time. They also get shorter because they're getting further away, and they also get closer together. And as long as I repeat that every single time, tilt more, shorten, get closer together, every time I go further into the distance, I get a pattern that makes it very, very clear that we're looking at a series of poles or something. They could be lampposts along a road, whatever it is, and they are disappearing into the distance. They're repeating and getting further away. Hopefully you can see the same patterns and work out what they are with all the other shapes. So with this new concept of pattern perspective, when you look at images like this fantastic piece by Kim Young-gi, this is actually hanging in my hallway, we get a better understanding of why these pieces work. There is no one perspective grid in here. There's so many things happening all at once. It's kind of crazy. However, there's a sense that we can still work out what's going on. And that's because locally within these areas, pattern perspective is respected. I've done my best to try and overlay what those areas actually are. I've drawn from some of the most prominent objects in the image. I've drawn boxes around them, or I've drawn important lines that indicate what horizontal or vertical lines are, certainly on building structures. And you can see that within these areas, this pattern is respected, even if it's not actually tied to a real perspective grid. So on this building back here, it's in the distance on a curved horizon, and these vertical lines, which we might normally expect to converge towards a vanishing point, instead we can just see that every line that goes vertical, if it's further towards the left, it's leaning towards the left at the top, and as it goes towards the right, it's leaning further towards the right at the top. But every time he uses this line, he makes sure that it fits the pattern. Similarly, down here, you can see these cubes, they lean more and more towards the left at the top. And then at some point, he has to transition from one local area of perspective to another. And this really just results in some sort of fudging the shapes. So here, this line across the ground, it's sort of an imaginary one, but you can see it is attempting to lock in to whatever this line would be in this perspective, and there's just something that follows that pattern in between. It's not wholly unrelated to either side. Instead, it's something that feels like a comfortable mid-ground. And in doing so, he's allowed to combine these scenes together and still give this sense of a continuous space. And to give you another example, again, sort of contrasting with the semi-realism of Kim Young-gi's work, I want to show you Demezu, who I think uses this idea of pattern perspective incredibly well in their work. and it feels very, very freeing, but also very, very expressive. And so in all of these examples, you can see individually objects are clearly in perspective, but there are lots and lots of competing perspectives within one scene that merge together in a way that feels very lively, very exciting. And importantly, whenever they set up a pattern, they make sure that they follow that pattern to its conclusion. For example, it might be the frames hanging on the wall here. They definitely follow a continuous pattern, or it's the angle of the stairs. The perspective pattern has to be respected, otherwise things start to feel disjointed. And for my final breakdown, I wanted to show this piece where we have the slight fisheye lens, this horizontal line coming across here. They're slightly curved, but they have a clear vanishing point. Meanwhile, the lines that govern the vertical edge of these buildings, you can see this follows something that doesn't make sense, really. However, it gives us a better sense in the context of the whole piece that we're on a very, very steep hill, and these buildings are all crowded together and kind of like trying to hang on to this very, very steep slope here. And the only reason I think it works and stays sort of consistent in our mind is because as he goes down this slope, this vertical line, it starts leaning to the left, it slowly shifts to lean to the right, and then starts to shift back to the left again. And as long as there is a fairly simple pattern that is being followed, but it's being followed accurately, we just kind of take it for what it is. So if I go back to the scene here, it's very, very clear that these buildings are at the top of the hill. These ones are clinging onto the edge of the street, but he's allowed to now make this street look so much steeper than it would be in real life. And I think that's really exciting. So I won't do a breakdown on these examples, but I recently discovered this artist called Rob Poynton, who does these beautiful paintings of streets in England, where he really exaggerates the angles involved. And again, it's the repetition of one idea that actually makes these possible. Without it, it would just make no sense. There's no way a car can attach to the road and stay there stably, no matter what parking brake you've got on, when it's this steep. But he's using abstraction to sort of like fudge exactly how the cars are touching the road when you get to these areas. Meanwhile, the buildings give all the context about the raising perspective. You can see this angle here that's defined by the edge of the roof. It starts from something that's sort of closer to a square, and as it moves up in this direction, that angle just gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter. And by following that pattern all the way to the top, it feels like everything is believably in perspective, whilst also just madly exaggerated. Which is why I love them. And you can see pieces like this, it's a little closer to that Demesu Posca one again, where at the bottom, the angle starts at a sort of reasonable vertical, and it leans out towards the left and then leans back towards the right again as it reaches the top of the hill. And this last example I've included for Lightbox specifically because I believe this was painted in the hills of LA, and it's just the most extreme one. It barely fits into my horizontal presentation, but it's a really wonderful piece because we get this sense that there's a huge verticality. And it helps us understand what the artist was feeling when they were standing there, standing at the top of some steps, but also looking up to a road that seems to snake ever higher up this hillside. Love you, Rob. So the final takeaway here is that the appeal itself comes from the patterns that are derived from perspective. Perspective patterns are important. It's not just the accuracy. And since we're talking about not worrying too much about accuracy, it's a nice segue into the organic. Now, here I have two boxes filled with a series of points. One of them is scattered somewhat randomly. One of them is scattered a little more organically. And again, audience participation. Which one do you find more appealing? Well, for me, it's clearly the one on the right. And this is a little unfair because, of course, I set these up exactly how I wanted them to be. But I'm going to go through a bunch of reasons why I find the one on the left to be less appealing, even though it still appears on its surface to be a random selection of dots. The first is to do with how these dots respect the edges of the canvas. Typically, we don't want to draw attention to the fact that we are creating artwork within a box. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we do this, why that's become standard. Honestly, it would be a talk for another time, though I would like to go into it. But for now, we just need to recognize that pretty much 90%, maybe 99% of artwork or media that we consume comes in a rectangle. And we don't want to draw attention to that rectangle. We want to immerse the viewer beyond the screen or beyond the canvas they're looking at to look at the image behind. And so we want to avoid any instances where we draw attention to the straight edges, verticals and horizontals. So in this case, I'm avoiding these lines that are drawn between points that essentially align up with the edge. That same logic can be applied to any arrangement of dots that start to look like shapes that we don't want to be there. For example, these dots all line up on the arc of a circle. And circles, as you may remember from the Pringles talk, typically denote flat shapes that are flat to the canvas you're looking at them on. And finally, simply more instances where lines are drawn between dots, where things seem to align in ways that aren't natural, that feel like there's a specific reason. Now, of course, if you were trying to draw boxes and things in perspective, you may want these to look like rigid and straight lines. But we're going for organic and the feeling of randomness, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. Now, finally, I've drawn triangles between all of these dots, essentially trying to make the smallest triangle that would fit between all of them. And by doing this, I reveal something about the spacing. If I remove the dots and we're left just with the triangles, I can fill these in and basically denote them as the large ones, the mediums, and the smalls. And so essentially by aiming for each dot to be a different distance from each other than the others, we naturally derive big, medium, small. And hopefully you'll agree that it's much more interesting and feels much more organic than the left example, where essentially all of these triangles feel like they're kind of just mediums or bigs, and there's very little variation between them. Again, one of the huge reasons why this looks flatter is because our daily experience of why objects are big or small is to do with distance. If something's close to us, it's bigger. If it's further away, it's smaller. And so if you have lots of shapes that are all the same size, they appear to be about the same distance on the page, which draws attention to the fact that you're looking at a flat image. And in most cases, we're trying to find ways to avoid that. We're trying to make illusions that give an image depth to make it look like there actually is distance in the page. So contrast between the distance between points leads to something that looks more organic, and it also naturally results in big, medium, small. And like I just mentioned with objects that are typically looking big because they're close and small in the distance, you can see how big, medium, small also derives simply from the fact that objects, when they're the same real-world scale but placed at different distances in the scene, it results in big, medium, small when transferred to a 2D image. Now here I want to show some examples that are a little more complex. At the top, we have a series of dots of different sizes. And if we drew a line through the center point of these, well, it seems like there's no problem. This line does not align with the top of the canvas. However, we're missing the fact that these now have a scale. So the upper edge of each of these dots does perfectly align. And so there's still this sense that it is flat to the screen because it draws attention to the canvas bounds. It feels almost like a UI element. Similarly, with these cards down at the bottom, to me, there's two that immediately jump out as feeling like they don't sort of feel as organic in the scene. And that's because they have an edge that, again, has just aligned itself perfectly with the edge of the canvas. And even when we are working with just dots, it's worth pointing out that, like with pattern perspective before, we can set up patterns that are very easily recognizable. And we really do need to remain aware of all these abstract positions and relative placements of objects in the scene. Here we have a bunch of long wavy lines, but they all stop at a very specific place in the center, which gives this illusion that the negative space is a real shape that was intended in the scene. So, organic shapes. In general, we enjoy them. For the reasons I just went over with how it derives from big, medium, small and our experience of the real world. But if I want to go into a few more sort of scientific and, again, objective reasons why we enjoy the organic, I can relate it back to how nature makes humans feel a lot better. There are plenty of studies that describe how just being out in nature will reduce our anxiety, boost mood, make us feel more relaxed, more rejuvenated, etc., etc. And of course, nature filled with trees, plants, all of this fun stuff, all of those things feel very organic shapes to us. But the important takeaway for appeal is that organic is not random. Random does not necessarily give us everything we need for something to feel organic to us. And we often have to get very specific and very deliberate with how we place objects in our artwork. Now, previously, we talked a little bit about abstraction when covering examples of pareidolia, but I want to talk about it again because, again, the experience that we have of real-world objects and the sort of information we get from our eyes leads to us being very, very good at extracting information from areas where information is limited. On the left, we have a few abstract blobs, but we can immediately understand that this is the shadow shapes hitting a face. In the middle, there's a figure that's sort of way off in the distance, but we imagine seeing a human at that distance. We're very, very good at immediately recognizing what that object is. Similarly, when things are blurry or out of focus, typically we can still understand what's underneath because we see the very, very subtle differences in how light and dark is coalescing, even when blurred, and we know what's hidden underneath. So our brains are excellent at understanding what's happening in the real world from much less information than we might typically get from an object. And typically, I think we prefer it when there is less information, but it is still clear what we're looking at. For example, if someone wants to hide in a forest, they would put on camouflage, and that makes it very difficult to find them within the scene. And you have to put in a lot of effort to sift through all the noise that's coming in visually to find the information that you actually want. And typically this means that simplification is actually very appealing. So it's a little more vague, but generally I find that our rule of appeal is simplicity because it makes communication efficient and it also tests our brain's ability to understand the abstract. Now, I want to talk a little bit about anatomy. The objective truth comes from observation, which naturally leads to realism. But of course, we all understand that we can stylize anatomy and make it look just as, if not more appealing to us. But it can often feel very unclear as to why this stylization actually works. Here, I've taken a very realistically proportioned man, and essentially, I'm trying to make him into something that's almost got the proportions of a square. Really, really big, really chunky, huge muscles, Hulk proportions essentially. But to do this, I have to be very careful with the things that I actually push and pull within the anatomy. Otherwise, I could just stretch the character and get the same proportions, but that is not going to work very well. So clearly there are some rules to what parts of the body withstand this exaggeration better than others. And to talk about that, we're going to first start off with mental models. These are the internal understanding of how to construct an object, like a human. Now, here we have an image that I made when I was just 4 years old, and it gives us some real insight into the mental model I had of a human when I was that age. I suspect my process looked a little like this. You draw a head, you draw a neck and body, give it some legs, give some arms, give the arms some hands, and then, how many fingers to put on the hands? As many as we like. Finished off with some hair, and then a face, which surprisingly even includes the nose, which is quite a nice detail for that age. This feels delightfully specific to me, but you're probably more familiar with the stick man. It's kind of the universal simplification of a human body. And as we learn more about art and anatomy, our mental model improves. So next might be this kind of blobby morph-like man. He now has structure. There is the sense that he actually has form and thickness, whereas the stick man didn't. And then after this, perhaps we actually start to think about proportion. And we do the first study of an anatomy man, where you compose the joints, you get a sense of exactly where the body can and cannot bend, and also the general proportions of the body. But I find that this is sort of the place where some artists get a little stuck and don't necessarily move on from, which can result in a bad mental model. For example, if we want to make a character look muscular, well, we add muscles. But that's a little more of a subtle process than simply making every line you use to draw it bulgy. And there are lots of reasons why your mental model might be underdeveloped. The most obvious is going to be education. Another one, which I think we're getting more and more of, which is great, is exposure, essentially seeing it done well by other artists. And the last one is language, which is the most interesting of the three, because it's not about what language you speak, be it French, German, English, Chinese. Instead, it's to do with how language breaks down our understanding of the world. So, for example, we know that a face has eyes, nose, and a mouth, but we very rarely use the words that describe the subtle features of the face, like the nasion, or the columella, or the philtrum, or the nasal bridge, etc., etc. And this is why, when learning anatomy, it really can be useful to learn the names of muscles, because you remember that they're there, and then you think to draw them. And if you don't remember they're there because you don't know what they're called, you often forget to draw them. So the mental model on the left represents what we expect based on our simplified understanding. And on the right, we have some extra details. And it's these details, the things that are the most different from this sort of basic understanding of the anatomy, that I think really communicate the most appealing parts of the anatomy. So the knee no longer has its sort of shallowest point at an even point on this bridge. Instead, there is a sort of dent below the kneecap. There is this little notch above the kneecap. And then the behind the knee, this point is no longer in line with the other two, which is perhaps not what we would expect. It's not what we'd intuit from a simplified mechanism, but it is what happens in real life. And you can see the same thing happen from the front view. We add that detail from before with the kneecap. And then if we go one step again to update this model from the front, you can see that these two lines are no longer aligned with each other. The indent on the inside of the leg is significantly lower than it is on the outside. And these offsets, I find, are the things that add appeal. They're the things that make it feel more natural, more realistic. They align with what we've observed from real anatomy. And it also nicely aligns with what we discussed before with the organic, where some of these distances are now less evenly spaced. They're no longer aligned with each other. They're not the same distance from each other. And all of this comes together to create things that feel more believable, but also more appealing. And my experience is that any part of the body that you go and look at and break down in this way, you will find, again, these offsets and unexpected terminations of lines that make it much more realistic, but also appealing to us. So it's by exaggerating these features that we can go from something that feels realistic to something that feels believable, yet clearly very stylized. In this example, you can see how the overlap of the bicep coming into the forearm is much, much more exaggerated. The distance that it covers is maybe 5, close to 10 times the distance it would be here, which is just this little amount. But by exaggerating it so much, we get a really good sense that there is a huge mass from the bulk of this muscle intersecting with the forearm. Similarly, I've made sure that this overlap here from the inside of the knee is much larger. The contour of the outside of his arm is much more exaggerated. The bulges of the muscle and its overlaps are pronounced. The last example I want to give is something very dear to my heart, and that is how people draw butts. We'll start with a dude. The simple but incorrect internal mental model is that you've got two big round things, and that's the butt, and you just connect it together and draw the rest of the body around it. And I find this to be very unappealing, hopefully for obvious reasons. Instead, we can update that mental model with something a little more realistic. The glutes have a bit more of a bean shape, and when we really consider the ramifications of those shapes and how it fits into the body, we get a much more natural result. We get areas that are sort of chiseled out because they're no longer just the outside of a round sphere. We get a more accurate depiction of where the widest point on the body is, at the hips, not at the waist. And of course, we get a nice opportunity for these offsets. Again, the widest part not just being a circle around where these big bulbous orbs are, but instead reflecting the bones underneath, wide at the hips, and then if you were to rotate the body to the side, it would protrude the most at the maximum point of the glutes. And we can perform the same thing with a generic female butt. Start with two round things and attached legs, and it's not going to feel quite right. Start with something that's a little more kidney bean shaped and respect where the width should be because of the bones underneath, and we start to get something much more appealing. Now, amusingly, I find it difficult sometimes to create these quote-unquote bad examples because it's very easy to make something look terrible, but I want there to still be a fair comparison with how I've approached each. But when making the talk, I googled butts and I got this horrible diagram that described different butt shapes with different names. And well, this is exactly what you should be avoiding, so it does the job for me. And to round this section out, hopefully you can see how I apply this in my sketches. In all of these cases, we'll just focus on legs for now. I'm making sure that no matter what, I'm including some indication of the difference between the inside and outside of the knee, because that's really important to show which leg is which. And in cases where we can see the hips and the outside of the leg, I need to make sure that this distance is smaller than this one. Similarly, with overlaps like this, I want to really make sure that I emphasize the rhythm of overlaps on one side from knee to calf to heel, and then smooth shapes on the outside because we get a nice contrast between the two. And of course, if you're looking to improve your anatomy skills, then life drawing really is the best place to look. But there is a strong caveat. Performing the life drawing is, of course, very important. You're training muscle memory, you're training your observation and all these skills, but you need to go back to the life drawing afterwards and analyze it. So this was a session that I did when I was in Bordeaux earlier this year with Artside School, and it was a really lovely session. And the sort of main takeaways I got from this session were this beautiful line that described the back leading into the love handle. And it's simply something that I had never paid that much attention to before. I'd never drawn and had certainly never been this exaggerated but appealing to me before. And you can even see on this example at the end, my default mental model took over when I drew it first. So I drew this line coming down here and I was like, well, I know what happens at the waist. It just joins the butt. It's just a smooth line that goes past the hip. And that was my, essentially, simplified mental model inside my head. And I had to correct it. I had to draw over the top because I realized I hadn't actually been drawing from life. I was just going off what I assumed was there. So ultimately, the rule of appeal for me is to emphasize the subtleties, emphasize the things that make the real world different to that simplified mental model inside your head. And it's important to point out that whilst artists need to understand it to be able to draw it and appreciate it, non-artists don't need to be able to understand how to draw it to still appreciate it. They will still see those subtle inclusions and it will add to their understanding of your image, regardless of whether they understand where it's coming from or not. Because oftentimes I do get stuck in this realm where I imagine a lot of these sort of high level or detailed concepts, maybe they just don't matter to the average person. Maybe it's only us artists getting very nerdy about it, but it really is the case that these will emphasize elements in your drawings that make anyone appreciate it better. And lastly, if this section wasn't long enough, I wanted to include this extra example of pareidolia because I think it exemplifies just how strong pareidolia can be when we start to include these subtleties. So much more than just having two eyes and a mouth. This guy has everything. He's got little black pupils within irises. He's got physical eyelids. The eyes are even within eye sockets. There's eyebrows above them. He's got a nose. He's got a mouth, complete with a little mustache. He's even got like thick sideburns, but then he's got a bald head. It's wonderful. Like, I see so many little details that conjure up this more and more sophisticated model of what a face is. And so despite this being an alarm clock, and I don't know who designed this and whether they had any idea what they were doing, it just looks so much like a grumpy little face. And I love it. Oh, yeah, and one more addition. He's even got the sternocleidomastoid. Like, damn, that's a detailed anatomy diagram. Okay, enough fun. We're back in the classroom to discuss novelty. We've talked a lot about rules which try to match our artistic expression to real-world experiences. The logic being that the real experiences we have are things that we enjoy and can relate to, everyone can relate to, and that gives us a way to talk about things more objectively. However, one reading of novelty is to show us things that we've never seen before. And so these two ideas feel like they are somewhat in conflict with each other. But I really don't think they are. To begin with, humans crave novelty. And all the social media platforms realize this, which is why they give you an endless feed, constantly new images, pictures, sounds to distract you and keep you locked into that doom scroll forever. And so in this final section, we're going to say goodbye to objectivity. And instead, I'm going to introduce you to this concept I call the map of infinite possibilities. This map shows the journey from this central point, which is a blank page. And it shows how every time we add something to this blank page, we're making a decision, we move further out to a new place on this map. Every step makes the artwork more complex and makes the journey longer. And you can imagine that if we decide we don't like one direction, we might undo it, go back to a previous node, and then continue in a different direction. Obviously, this happens in digital far more easily than it does in traditional. And the further out we go on this map, typically things are going to become more novel, because the more decisions that go into something, the more specific it is, and the further it differentiates itself from other artwork. But novelty alone is not enough. For example, we might end up in places that are definitely different to things we've seen before, but are not appealing at the same time. At every point in this journey, an artist is trying to keep things in balance, trying to keep the artwork appealing to them. And of course, they can make mistakes. There are many, many versions of the artwork which are unsuccessful, where novelty alone was not satisfactory. But after all these attempts, an artist will find the direction, the path that feels right to them. So typically, our goal as artists is to navigate further and further out into this map while still keeping things in balance, finding these points where everything feels right. And of course, the same core idea can go in wildly different directions, and those directions can be completely undone and taken in a different direction and result in a very different feeling in the final image. Now, obviously this map is far too complex to portray in any format. Doesn't really matter what dimension. But the important thing is that the further away you get from the center, you can see these rings get bigger and bigger and bigger. The further away you sort of progress, the more choices you make as an artist in your artwork, the more potential there is to explore, and the more novel ideas there are that you could land on. And the destination we find, I call a node. And this essentially is where an artist has chosen this place to stop. They've called the artwork finished, they've shared it with the world, because they find for them, in that moment, they're satisfied with the result. But importantly, these nodes are very rare, and they are difficult to find, which is why artists spend so much time learning their fundamentals, learning all of these different concepts, because that is what allows them to navigate this path to find those rare but valuable nodes. So what? What does this analogy actually give us? Well, one of the big reasons I like this analogy is that it reinforces a philosophy I've had for a long time that helps me push through the difficult stages of a painting or drawing. Quite simply, it's the idea that there's always a solution to the problem in front of you. And this map sort of allows me to visualize the fact that there is going to be a node nearby that solves that solution, that makes it feel like things are once again in balance and appealing to me. And it doesn't require me to restart. It doesn't require me to throw away hours of work that I've already put in. And of course, we can get very, very precise with this. It's an infinite map, which means just like a fractal, you can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in and find more and more complexity. It just becomes more and more precise and more subtle. So within this node, there may be all sorts of different directions I could go. These are tweaks that I could make to the color palette. These are perhaps moving my focal point slightly to the right, slightly to the left. And somewhere within here, there will be the brightest node that I can find at my skill level. The brightest one, the one that feels the most successful for that specific arrangement of components in the scene or color palette or whatever it is. But it also gives me this idea that somewhere outside of this node is something else, where perhaps I add a big foreground element that covers half the composition, but as a result, gives me the depth that I was lacking. Or for example, it is removing a focal point, or simply moving it, or flipping the image. Like something substantial, a big change, but is still along this path, still part of the same idea that I'm trying to solve. And I find it really useful because when I use this sort of mentality to approach artwork, it results in me taking my piece and doing rough paintovers, imagining that I'm like an art director and I'm just doing very, very rough additions or rough sort of edits that can let me explore these nearby ideas, these nearby nodes, just to see what's out there. And so it leads to something which I often give as advice. When you're stuck on a piece of artwork, treat it like you're giving it a paint over. Copy it out of your Photoshop file. You don't want there to be any layers. You don't want any sort of sense that you're trying to preserve anything about the original image, and just be rough with it. Tear it apart. Make big and bold changes, because that lets you explore this space of nodes, find interesting novelty, find interesting solutions, without worrying that you're going to remove hours of work or anything like that. And there is always something you could do that would make your artwork better, which is a bit of a daunting thought. That's the sort of thing that can get you into this loop of never finishing a piece, never feeling satisfied with the conclusion. But similarly, it also frees you to explore more, to find solutions more easily. And I find that that's a trade-off I'm very happy with. The second big reason is to recognize that every artist is unique in their ability to navigate this map. The infinite possibilities available mean none of us are ever going to take the same path twice. And that alone makes the result worth sharing. And so here it is, a summary of all of the rules of appeal that I have derived from contrast and patterns, which ultimately come from the raw experience of the world around us. Appeal and the objectively good. Thank you very much. Now, this is a little bonus section because I prepared the talk knowing that I would have some free time for Q&A and things, but I also wanted to make sure that if people had specific questions about how I implement it, I could go to this example. So I won't spend too long here, but it is a good example to break down just because it exemplifies all the things I've just talked about. I'm very lucky to have worked on this card. It was for the new Magic the Gathering set, and I'm very excited because they have released some cards, and next year we'll release the rest of them. I've actually got quite a few, so I'm excited to show you them. Regardless, here's a little breakdown. So we talked about pattern perspective and how we can really break away from perspective that's real. And here I did a very similar thing to that piece that Dozu Posca had made, where the road is just super slanted. Like, this is incredibly steep. And I wanted to feel like that so that all the action feels like it's hurtling down towards us. But at the same time, to do this and still show all the content in the scene, really I wanted to emphasize this only using the buildings in the back. Meanwhile, the foreground and all these objects, we could kind of imagine, they're not quite on a flat ground, but I've tilted the camera up so that we can see all these objects at a reasonable angle, so we can see the face of the turtle properly, see the design of the van properly, etc, etc. This means all of that sort of extra downward motion is relegated to the background. So these buildings having such an extreme angle on them and tilting all the way up, that gives us this sense that we're sort of falling down backwards. Meanwhile, I'm allowed to have the road essentially appear like a normal horizon line. So this is sort of how I'm pushing and pulling perspective in ways that doesn't make logical sense but supports the feeling I want from the image. And then we've got other things like these lines here sort of indicate a vanishing point back here, but I'm making choices with the turtle van, which essentially has its own perspective sort of grid. So again, I don't really think about grids in the same way. Instead, I'm imagining there's a vanishing point that all of the important lines on the van point towards. But because I want it to really feel like it's coming, like punching out the screen towards us, I'm not doing my typical technique where I'd want to show the top and bottom, because it was tempting to try and Pringle the van and actually see the underside of the van at the back as well. But instead, I settled simply for not seeing any of the top or bottom, to have this sense that the van is punching out of the screen so close to us, we only see this edge and two sides. And ultimately that felt better, and it set up a better connection point for Donatello. But you can see this line here is actually raising up and away, like it's not actually getting closer to the ground at the back, it's getting further away. And this was, again, something that kind of breaks away from what you'd normally expect. Same thing with this line. If this van was just flat on the ground in perspective, you'd expect this line to tilt down towards this side. But I've deliberately chosen not to, so that the van itself, this sort of local area of perspective, feels as strong as possible. And then finally, we've got these really sort of big gesture lines throughout the piece. I've just very roughly marked the ones that sort of stand out the most. Importantly here, none of these lines, especially the one on the ground, none of them align with the edge of the canvas. Obviously, horizon lines are often going to be perfect horizontals, and if that aligns with the canvas edge, it's not a problem. But in this case, I'm going for the Dutch angle. I want there to be as much sort of action and movement as possible. So it was important that none of these, even these lines back here, align with the edge. It's worth noting that, of course, if I set up a perspective grid that has an angle coming in, leaning to the left on this side and leaning to the right on this side, something in the middle, if I follow the pattern properly, something in the middle is going to be perfectly vertical, but it's within context. And I've also made sure that those areas are not close to the canvas edge. So here, this line here, this is perfectly vertical, but it's got so much stuff in between that I no longer draw a comparison between this line and the edge of the canvas. Like, I just don't connect them because we've got all of this information and all these other sort of stronger lines in between. So it's no longer an issue. An issue would be, for example, if this van was rotated so that this line here felt like it was aligned to the vertical, because this is such a large and prominent shape in the image. It's why I've ended up drawing it on this diagram here. Like, if this was vertical, even if it was in the center of the screen, I think I would still draw that sort of like sense of balance. Like, if it was vertical in the center, it would better sort of match an image that's trying to be as sort of composed and serene as possible. So you can imagine maybe like a temple or something on a hill where someone's meditating. In that case, fantastic, you want that sense of balance. You want the temple to be aligned with the center. But I don't, so That's an example of where I would fight as much as possible to make sure that this line would never align with the vertical. Oh, and this was going to be my other example that I could talk about, but in this case, nobody has any questions because you're all online. So I suppose if you have questions, put them in the comments. I can try and answer them, but I can't point with my cute little tiny cursor. I hope you noticed that, by the way. Yes, I made a cursor for Tiny. I'll make a video at some point. I really want to demonstrate the whole thing, but he's just so cute. I couldn't not do my talk with it. When I was doing this in person, of course, I had a laser pointer, but here you get a little mouse pointer instead. Anyway, thank you all for listening. Thank you to everyone that actually saw this talk in person and had questions and clapped along and all that good stuff. I had a lot of fun putting it together. I hope you learned something useful from it. All right, big love. Bye-bye.